Thanks, Walter. And thanks, everyone, for coming. It's my pleasure to present here as part of the Community Center Brown Bag series. And as Walter mentioned, the title of my talk today is The Net Black Advantage in Educational Transitions and Educational Careers Approach. In 2008, then-Senator Barack Obama proclaimed, "The fight for economic and social justice begins in the classroom." This statement embodies the widely held belief that increased educational attainment among disadvantaged minority groups can lead to a reduction in racial inequalities and other social and economic realms. Over the past 50 years, numerous social policies cultivating educational achievement have succeeded in increasing participation in education among all Americans. So currently, the average educational attainment of adults has never been higher, and more individuals participate in education than ever before. However, these trends are not necessarily indicative of a large-scale shift towards racial parity in educational attainment. For instance, as it shows there, in 2009, about 37% of white adults aged 25 to 29 obtained a bachelor's degree, while only about 19% of black adults had attained that degree of education. And similarly, with graduate and professional degrees, about 9% of white adults hold one of these degrees, compared to only about 4% of black adults. And these differences have, in fact, remained relatively stable since about the 1970s, indicating that although some gains in educational parity have been made, there remain significant obstacles to equality of educational outcomes. In contrast to these trends, researchers investigating racial inequality in educational attainment have discovered what has been termed a net black advantage in educational attainment. This net black advantage refers to the research finding that controlling for socioeconomic status and other academic characteristics, black students are in fact more likely to attend college than their white counterparts. To date, most research investigating this phenomenon is really focused on college enrollment. And as such, they've investigated factors specific to college enrollment, such as affirmative action policies and the different types of colleges that students enroll in. And the evidence to date indicates that this net black advantage indeed exists across college types and is in fact somewhat stronger for lower socioeconomic status students. In the current research, I followed Bourdieu and Passeron's educational careers approach to determine whether examining multiple educational transitions, starting from middle school through high school, may elucidate the seemingly anomalous net black advantage pattern. Bourdieu and Passeron suggest that scholars interested in educational success of students should conceive of the educational system as a dynamic process of selection and exclusion, during which the effects of ascriptive and other factors may vary over time. So, in sum, or in essence, an educational careers framework asks if those same characteristics that scholars have identified as being important for educational attainment may change, if the effects of those factors may change in nature as students progress through their educational careers. Moreover, this approach questions whether static analyses of patterns, such as the net black advantage, may lead researchers to erroneous conclusions. So the educational careers approach may be particularly important for the net black advantage, given the likely role that selection could play in the process. So the typical reasoning for a selection explanation of the net black advantage is that black students are less likely to make early educational transitions. So they're less likely to get to the later years of high school, say. Therefore, when comparing just high school seniors on the transition to college, you might see this net black advantage pattern, which may not necessarily reflect the experience of all students, but rather may emerge due to differential selection into higher grades. In contrast, a few studies have shown evidence of a net black advantage through the high school years. While not quite as consistent as the evidence for post-secondary entry, there is some evidence that throughout the high school years, controlling for, again, socioeconomic status and academic characteristics, that black students may be as likely or even more likely to remain in school through high school graduation. Now to date, these findings, particularly the findings for high school, have not really been linked to research showing the net black advantage for college enrollment. And generally, researchers look at this as an anomalous finding. So here I ask whether a selection process can account for the net black advantage, or if a net black advantage is seen earlier in student careers as well. In addition to selection, an educational careers approach considers students' subjective experiences as important factors in shaping their academic careers. Bourdieu and Passeron draw on the concept of habitus, or a unifying principle of conducts and opinions, which at every moment of an academic or individual biography tends to reproduce the objective conditions from which it is the product. This concept is developed to explain how structural constraints can lead some students to seemingly choose to pursue less education. This concept is also important because it describes how social structural hierarchies are incorporated into individual subjective experience and are in turn objectified through actors' conduct in daily life. So the educational careers approach, being premised on that it's important to understand education across time, also looks at how these subjective factors may vary over time. From this view, it's important to not only ask how do students' expectations affect educational attainment, but also explore possible differences in how these effects may change over time. Namely, an important question from the educational careers perspective is whether student expectations about their likely status become more closely aligned with empirical probabilities that they will attain any given level of education, or do these expectations fall off in importance as more objective criteria such as test scores or grades become more paramount. Another aspect of habitus that's important to understand is that manifestations of habitus can vary based on the social field under question. So in the context of education, it's really important to consider the history of education for Black Americans compared to their white counterparts. Whereas white Americans have been able to take for granted the opportunity to obtain education commensurate with social standards, Black Americans have not had this luxury, and instead have had to struggle to obtain equal access. So from clandestine schooling during slavery to the Niagara movement and through the civil rights movement of the 60s, educational pursuits have been central for the struggle of rights and status in American society. For instance, Bauman concluded that historically restricted opportunity structures have led to a heightened cultural importance for education for Black families, which in turn may lead to a net Black advantage pattern. Now, this conceptualization is also consistent with abundant empirical evidence that indicates that at any given level of socioeconomic status, Black students have higher expectations and aspirations for future education than their white counterparts. All of these arguments generally suggest a pattern in which these higher levels of expectations and aspirations may account for the net Black advantage. So to summarize, this research seeks to clarify the net Black advantage pattern by examining 3 educational transitions to determine whether race is differentially associated with educational transition over time. So the 3 educational transitions that I'll model are the transition from 8th grade to 10th grade, from 10th grade to high school graduation, and from high school graduation to post-secondary enrollment. So hypotheses 1, A, and B, and hypothesis 2, these pretty much sort of exemplify that selection pattern. This would be consistent with the selection pattern. We would see that Black students would be less likely to have a successful transition sort of earlier on, from the 8th grade to the 10th grade, or from 10th grade to high school graduation. And then the net Black advantage would only emerge in college enrollment. So hypothesis 1 indicates less likely to make earlier transition, and hypothesis 2 indicates they'd be more likely to make a successful transition to post-secondary enrollment. Hypothesis 3 and 4 are about the effects of expectations. So hypothesis 3, the positive effect of student expectations and perceived parental aspirations will increase over time as students age. And hypothesis 4 indicates that including these subjective factors may account for or eliminate the net Black advantage pattern. So the data from this project, I'll go quickly, is drawn from the National Educational Longitudinal Survey. It's a sample. The sample I use is 5,427 white students and 701 black students. This was the 8th grade class of 1988. So if I did the math right, they were born in approximately 1974. And here I use measures from 1988, 1990, 1992, and 2000. The dependent variable, as I mentioned, are these 3 educational transitions. So essentially, I model whether they made a successful transition from 8th grade to 10th grade, whether they make a successful transition from 10th grade to high school graduation, and whether they make a successful transition from high school graduation to post-secondary enrollment. For this model, I try to draw on typical variables for educational attainment models. Your basic sort of SES variables here. So the models have mostly dummy variables for black, male, parents married, parents college graduate, low family income, high family income. Then I have number of siblings. Then this home environment measure is sort of a measure of educational environment in the home. It's basically a count of whether they have a computer and a dictionary and an atlas and these kinds of things. And I don't want to get too much into the modeling, but for a model like this, the longitudinal model, it's really important to also include what we call time-varying independent variables. So these are variables that, depending on the year they're measured, can take a different value. The other ones are stable over the time. So I have 3 time-varying measures. The first one is a proficiency measure, and this is math, science, and reading combined. And that one ranges 0 to 100. I have the expectation for a college degree. It's just coded 1 equals yes, and then perceived parental aspirations, also coded 1 equals yes. And these were measured again 8th, 10th, and 12th grades. So the analytic strategy here is what's called a generalized estimating equation. It's basically just an elaboration on what we call a discrete time hazard model. And the way it elaborates is it also accounts for dependency across the different transitions. So the same person is observed numerous times, and so this model accounts for that dependency. I won't get too far into it. If anybody's interested in the model, just let me know. More than happy to talk about it. So getting into the results. So to begin, this here is what are the results from what's called the unconditional model. So this model only includes the effect for black. So this is not controlling for socioeconomic status or academic background. And here we can see the educational inequality that we're all familiar with and that I alluded to in the beginning. So we can see that, and so this is from a logit model. So the odds ratios here, the whites are fixed at 1 because they're the reference group. And we can see that black students, the sort of light green, are less likely to make each transition before we control for any other variables. The next slide shows what has been referred to as this net black advantage. Once you control for SES and academic characteristics, you see that the likelihood for black students to continue on in their education is higher for 10th grade, for 12th grade, and for post-secondary entry. So this result alone is in contrast to hypotheses 1 and 2 because it indicates that a selection pattern would be unlikely to account for this net black advantage because we see the net black advantage across the students' educational careers, a persistent positive effect of race. One important caveat to this net black advantage pattern is that it is a counterfactual pattern that would occur if white and black students had similar socioeconomic backgrounds and similar academic characteristics. Unfortunately, they do not. So this chart shows predicted probabilities using the students' actual observed scores on all the independent variables. And so the first one is just the probabilities for white students. So you can see white students, 96% go to the 10th grade from the 8th grade, 87% graduate from high school, and about 78% enter college. The second one shows the effect for black students from the model. So you see 95%, 81%, and 71%. So although the net effect of black is positive, when you look at the actual probabilities, black students still see a disadvantage. Then this last line shows the probabilities for race if there was no effect, or the probability for black students if there was no effect for race. And we can see that in each case, they're about 10% lower. So what this graph shows is that this net black advantage pattern that you see in the statistical model really abates what would otherwise be much larger racial disparities in educational attainment. This graph shows how race and socioeconomic status together shape students' transition probabilities. And so here we have, and these are actually hypothetical probabilities from the model. So we can see that in each case, the net black advantage pattern is more pronounced among students with disadvantaged family backgrounds. So we can see if you compare the blue line there and the pink, that is for students with low SES. So you can see for 10th grade black students with low SES, 86% transition to 10th grade. For white students, only 69%. And then for high school graduation, 81 and 71. And then for college, 42 and 34. We can see among the students with more advantaged family backgrounds, those differences are much smaller. So you see 99% for black students with advantage compared to 98, 97 and 95, and then 84 and 78. So this net black advantage pattern, consistent with the literature, is more pronounced for students with a lower SES. This graph, I used these graphs because I didn't want to give you a bunch of tables. This graph shows the odds ratios from a model that controlled for the expectations and aspirations. And what we see here, and it's kind of hard to tell because you can't really see how much it's gone down, but in each case, the effect of race has been reduced by the inclusion of expectations and aspirations. And in fact, when we get to post-secondary, we see no significant difference at all. And so this indicates that, especially at later stages of educational careers, these subjective factors, the expectations and aspirations, really can explain the net black advantage pattern. And it's also consistent with hypothesis 3, because the effect of aspirations and expectations in particular increases over the course of student careers. This last figure, I think it's the last figure, shows the effects from an interaction analysis of race and expectations. And so it highlights how sort of socioeconomic status, expectations, and race all play together. For the 10th grade and high school graduation transitions, the effects of expectations are similar for black and white students. So here we have a black student, high expectation, black student, low expectation. White student, high, white student, low. Now we can see the differences between the green and the blue, and that, what's that, tan, and the pink, about the same. At high school graduation, you see the difference starts to get a little bigger, especially for black students. Then at college entry, you can see the difference between a black student with a high expectation and a black student with low expectation is pretty dramatic, right? 60% more likely if you have high expectations to attain post-secondary education compared to low. For white students, the differences do get bigger over time, but not quite as dramatically as for black students. Okay. So, to quickly go over the hypotheses, I find no support for hypotheses 1 and 2, which were these hypotheses consistent with a selection argument. A selection process does not explain the net black advantage pattern, and instead we find that this pattern is characteristic of student transitions across this portion, at least, of their educational careers. Hypothesis 3, which argued that the effects of expectations and aspirations would increase over time, was supported. I find, especially for expectations, the effect gets stronger as students get older. And then hypothesis 4, A and B, was also supported in that in each case, including expectations and aspirations to the model reduce the net black advantage pattern, and particularly for post-secondary education, reduce that difference to non-significance. So I argue that these findings highlight the utility of an educational careers approach to racial differences in educational attainment, and underscore the importance of developing explanations for educational outcomes that acknowledge the dynamic nature of students' educational careers. As noted, some scholars have asked if this net black advantage pattern might be driven by policies such as affirmative action or other enrollment policies specifically designed to increase minority enrollment in U.S. colleges. The findings presented here indicate these explanations alone are inadequate to account for this pattern that appears to be a feature of educational transitions throughout high school. Additionally, the findings indicate that a consideration of subjective factors, here operationalized as student expectations and aspirations, adds to our understanding of the net black advantage pattern. I show that the effects of expectations increase for black students relative to white students as they progress in their educational careers, and including these variables into models of educational careers reduces the net effect of for black students. And while some studies have examined expectations and manifestations of student habitats in the past, here I frame these differences in attitudes in a much different way than we typically see. In contrast to an approach based on this habitats concept, the more common conceptualization in the literature for student attitudes and beliefs is the so-called oppositional culture model, drawn from the work of John Ogbu. The current paper adds to an abundance of evidence that indicates that the attitudes and beliefs of students do not explain racial differences in educational outcomes. As numerous scholars have noted, Black Americans' habitats is shaped by a unique historical location, which has led to a cultural form that often centers around the importance of striving to overcome difficult circumstances. In addition, the focus on education as a way to overcome both economic oppression and negative stereotypes. It follows that black students may view educational pursuits more positively and see the expectation of a college diploma as an important component of their self-representation. Consistent with this formulation, I find both that black students have higher expectation given their family backgrounds, and that for black students, holding the expectation of a college degree is nearly as beneficial as having an advantageous family background. And in terms of the future studies, this study only follows students through college enrollment. So the question that still remains is what happened after college? And so future studies should try to build models of educational careers that follow students through college. One possibility is that these patterns are characteristic of what has been called sort of this deferred exclusion, which would basically mean that although minority students are more likely to attend college, they're much more likely to not finish. So that would be the next study. Thank you.
Well, there's lots of time for questions, comments, contributions.
One question. I really enjoyed your talk. Was there a measure, and this is not connected to what you're talking about today, but I wonder if there's a measure that assessed a school measure that asked the kids, were you able to take into account which high schools or which junior high schools the kids were attending? I was wondering if there was some type of impact of maybe a school culture on aspirations. And so that's my question. Is there kind of a school culture measure that asks kids, the number of kids who went to the same high school or what have you?
Well, yes and no. The problem with the school measures is that when you're doing the longitudinal model is that the students change schools.
All right.
Right? And especially the NELS data. So not to get too technical, but they started by sampling schools, 8th grade, and they had this brilliant plan that they'd be able to find the same kids in the 10th grade, but they found a huge dispersion. So it's awkward. I could put in an 8th grade school measure, But then, what does that really mean when you're looking at high school or college enrollment because they're at a different school? You don't know how many of the kids change schools compared from their 8th grade.
Okay.
But that would be, right, an obvious thing to look at. But the easy answer is it's hard to do a longitudinal model
Okay.
if the sort of level 2 or the school characteristics change over time.
Got it. Got it. I have a follow-up question then.
You do?
Sure, no? Yeah. All right. And this is just speculation, but I mean, has there been any research looking at, for example, Hispanic Americans? And how does this, will this model also work, or how do you think it would be different if you're looking at Hispanic Americans or Asian Americans?
Yeah. So in another version of this, I had all three.
Okay.
And I'm trying to remember what the pattern was. I believe so there was a slight advantage for Hispanic students. It wasn't quite as dramatic, and I think it was only the 10th grade transition and the high school graduation, and it wasn't there for college in any model.
Got it.
I really enjoyed your talk too. And I think it's really interesting to think about what race really means. So I'm wondering if you can talk to us about what are the long-term implications of your results? Because on one hand, it looks like race matters and can have a positive effect, or at least being black in certain contexts might have a positive effect on education, but not long-term. But in the end, with all of these other variables reducing the effect of race, what does it mean in the end? Does race matter, or do these other variables actually matter? And if I were a policymaker or someone looking at these results, what am I supposed to take away from it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's why it's really important to look at both sort of the model in that net effect, and then also look at those probabilities with the average outcomes, because, right, like I said, that net effect is counterfactual, right? That's just if you had two students with the exact same background, that's what it would look like, right? But given the differences in family background, especially this data is from '88, right? You see huge disparities if you just look at the average probabilities. So I think, right, along with a lot of research in sociology of education, it indicates that these economic inequalities still matter a lot. And then the second thing would be sort of contrasting it to this oppositional culture idea, because by far, I mean, it's the most commonly cited theory in terms of how student attitudes and beliefs affect education, but there's very little evidence that it exists. And so hopefully this is part of a body of research that will try to reconceptualize how people think about student attitudes and their role in educational attainment.
Just following up on Heather's comment, when Wilson published his controversial thesis, The Declining Significance of Race, there was a huge backlash. How is the sociology of ed avoiding this backlash? Because your findings, in essence, are supporting his thesis, right?
Well, I mean, I think one thing is that very few people acknowledge, right? And that's sort of part of the thing, I didn't really get into it, but there's this whole section about how it's found in all these studies, but nobody really links it, right? So there's maybe 3 or 4 papers that actually use the phrase. The biggest one is like the Bennett and Shui 2003. And so I think because it's sort of very nuanced, not a lot of people know about it. And then anytime presenting something like this, it's just important to really contextualize and understand, right? It's not saying that somehow whites are disadvantaged.
Right.
Right.
You can see how easily that's the way the lay population is going to interpret some of this verbiage.
Definitely.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, and I was giving a talk on this one time, and someone in the audience just stood up and said, "You're wrong. This doesn't exist." So you have to be, I think, pretty judicious in terms of how you present it. And so that's why I always present the average probabilities as well to show, right, this is in effect a counterfactual pattern. And it really, I think, what I'm arguing at least, is that it highlights the importance of these attitudes and beliefs.
So just to continue, one more quick
Yeah.
question. So do you have any type of anxiety that your work is going to be misrepresented by the media when they get a hold of this? Because that's what happened to Wilson. I mean, Wilson never said that race didn't matter. He said that it
If
was
I had the
less
same outcome
salient.
as him,
Yeah. True.
but yeah, I mean, I think it is, you have to be careful in terms of how you explain it.
Right.
Especially because, I mean, in the media, right, they're not going to understand what
They're not even
statistical
reading it.
control means and what the model results actually indicate.
Right.
I have a question about the measurement of aspirations and expectations.
Yes.
Was that a family measure, like they asked them what their parents expect them to go to college, or what was the question?
Expectations, it says, how much education do you expect to get? Right, and it's kind of difficult just because they change the exact way they measured it each year. And so the most meaningful comparison I could make out of the measure that they have is just expected a college degree or didn't. And about between 67 and 74% of the students in any given year said yes to that. And I mean, I've tried it all sorts of different ways. It's really those students who say no, they don't expect to get a college degree that are different from anyone in a higher category. And then the other one is the same metric, and they just said how much education do you think your parents want you to obtain?
Yeah, so following up on Heather's point, the policy question, and playing off the notion of the counterfactual conceptualization of the problem. Can you talk about, in a policy way, what it means to reduce the variance between blacks and whites when you control for SES variables? That is, you're taking this much variance out of the difference, right? So if we were to go out and do something, are we going to focus on making a difference at the level of attitudes, or are we going to make a difference in terms of jobs and income? So to kind of reverse that, to talk about the policy.
Well, I guess both, right, would be the ideal. So the difficulty, right, with the linear modeling is, again, this net effect. And it's a conceptualization that race is something that's could vary randomly. That I could give it to someone like a pill would affect their health, right? And then policy makers, more and more want that kind of modeling, right? They want this causal effect modeling, but because it's race, right? It's not an aspirin. You can't separate it from family background. At least you can't right now, right? So I think that's sort of the one point that's important to stress, that although I have some understanding of the point of the causal modeling approach, but when you're dealing with something that really couldn't be administered or sort of fixed for someone, then it's sort of important to look at how it interacts with family background. But I think one thing, and one chart that I didn't show, is show that for a black student with a disadvantaged family background and low expectations, their probability of attending college was like 7. So I think that really shows that it's both of those together are really a combination that leads to really poor outcomes. So I think, I wouldn't be the kind of person to say it's all attitudes, right? We should just focus and put the onus on the students themselves. But, if you were in a choice where if you had to think about how student attitudes affect education, it's important to acknowledge that most of the evidence indicates that black students' attitudes are actually more conducive to educational attainment than white students. Did that answer your question?
Well, yeah.
If you have any policy ideas, that's the last thing
I guess
I'm working on.
what prompted me was going back to the Coleman argument that led to busing.
Sure.
That it's role modeling, changing the attitude, forgetting really about the neighborhood and the
School.
and the income and jobs structure.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking about that, and then trying to ask myself, how can you turn it, the argument, to play off of that this isn't a Coleman repeat kind of perspective. That
Yeah.
there is something valuable in the policy question when we look at removing the impact of SES variables.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the Coleman thing, right, has just been reiterated over and over again.
Right.
And it's always that thing, well, the school, you know, it's the home. And it's almost as if the home isn't affected by poverty and
Yeah,
these kinds of
yeah,
things, right? So,
Right.
But this is another policy question. The initial finding is that blacks and whites are of a similar socioeconomic background. The black students are more likely to get to 10th grade, get to high school, and get to college. But the reality is that blacks and whites are not of the same socioeconomic background.
Yep.
And that there's big gaps in SES between blacks and whites. And to me, the policy implication is that if African Americans and whites, if the SES gap between blacks and whites shrunk, then you would have more blacks getting to 10th grade, getting to high school, finishing high
Exactly.
school and getting to college. And the affirmative action implication is that it's a wise investment. It's a wise investment to come up with policy strategies that have the impact of reducing SES, quality of life differences between blacks and whites. And that you're not throwing money away.
Exactly.
Because that will make a difference. And actually, given your data, it will have a more positive impact on blacks than whites,
Exactly.
given the existing aspirations. So to me, in terms of the fear of the Wilson argument, to me that's the argument I would make, that it's a wise investment. That right now, these large gaps contribute to these huge gaps. And I mean, you put up the chart of 37 versus 19% of blacks versus whites finishing college.
yeah.
That gap would, shrink if not reverse, as we move closer to racial equality.
To try to, exactly, right? So the idea with affirmative action is you can step in where you can
Right.
to overcome those
But really, it's not
differences in
affirmative-
family background.
Really, it's not affirmative action you're looking at. Really, you're looking at policies that reduce economic disparities. So that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Not by the time you get to college and you make differences at that point, but way before that.
Yeah. But I also think, I guess maybe this doesn't really speak to it, but there's just yesterday where the Supreme Court said they're going to rehash racial admission policies, right? And we can probably assume what will happen. And I think that these kinds of findings would indicate that if you take those away, the result will not be good,
Right.
right? And it's not because these students don't want to do well. That's the crazy thing, is this idea that students don't want to do well. They don't want to succeed.
But the other issue that, according to your data, affirmative action as existing policy, it's not enough. You need to have economic policies that increase levels of employment, reduce levels of poverty, all the infrastructure differences between black and white communities need to be looked at if you really want to address the education gap.
Absolutely.
And that's what I would argue, given your data, given your findings.
I like the idea of an educational careers approach and thinking about all these transitions together. But looking at the slides and sort of thinking about the cumulative effect and which educational transition needs more, I was wondering if you would make any comments or conclusions about which of these educational transitions really shows either a net black advantage more or really matters most in determining educational careers. I'm thinking, does the 8th grade to 10th grade transition really mean as much as one of these others? And can you see a net black advantage more or less overall, or class differences more or less overall all in one of the transitions versus the others?
Yeah, well, the effects, I mean, just sort of the results, right? It's largest at the earliest level. So really, for early dropout, really early dropouts, and again, this data, when they were going into 10th grade, it was like 1990, so not as many states had compulsory policies through 18. I mean, that's the best way to stop high school dropouts, is to have a law that says you have to stay in school till you're 18. That's been shown. The states that have that law don't have nearly the dropout rates. But I think, you know, from this perspective and the way I've sort of argued that the modeling follows along with the theory, the importance of that 8th grade, that 10th grade transitions, you have to do that if you want to do the next one, right? And you have to do the next one if you want to go to college. So you, rather than conceptualize education as just a sort of a continuous thing that you have more or less of, right? You conceptualize as a process of like binary not decisions, but outcomes, right? So I know what you're saying, but I love to go there because it kind of would try to keep it where I'm arguing that this is the way to model it based on the theoretical approach. So, and then the last two, sort of the high school graduation and college enrollment, the effects there tend to be pretty similar.
I'm thinking about the changes that Wayne State's making in the admission policy. When you talk about college education, does it take into account traditional four-year school, community college, trade school?
Any?
Well,
no, it's either 2-year or 4-year. But there's so like the two of the most well-known studies. The one compared 2-year, 4-year colleges and found no difference like in the pattern. And then the one looked at 4-year, 2-year, and then HBCUs, and they found no difference across the three. So most of the literature indicates that the type of college doesn't have a huge difference.
But couldn't that potentially change over the long run as universities like Wayne raise the bar? I mean, wouldn't your research suggest that that's going to push some students out?
Yeah.
Where type of school might matter?
But one of the most interesting studies was this guy in the early 90s, so he had census data, historical, I don't know where he got this data, but I mean, he showed that this existed even in the early 1960s, the same pattern. And so that was sort of the one study that really cast doubt on college admissions policies having a huge impact. And so here, because I argue that it's really seen across that high school, the high school years, that the college admissions policies don't, they're not likely as a general explanation of the pattern.
So your third hypothesis, where it was high school to post-secondary, and post-secondary would be 2-year school or a 4-year school,
Yes.
or inclusive of both.
Yeah.
So it is the possibility that, I'm thinking about what he was saying, Wayne State modifying under adjustments, that if we can get more of the individuals to graduate at the community college level, if you will, and then maybe there'll be another study to evaluate or follow them as they get serious about coming to a 4-year institution and beyond, masters and above. We can really see an increase over time in general for the population, but we would definitely see a jump, in my opinion, if this was from high school to post-secondary and those that may be taking the community school route as opposed to jumping right into 4-year universities. So,
Yeah.
look like there can be some positive movement for everybody, all stakeholders.
Yeah, and then I think the biggest limitation here is that based on the way the data are, I can't really see what happened after they started college. And so it's likely, right, that you would not see the same pattern, but no one has really, not that many studies have really looked at it. And here I couldn't do it because they didn't measure those expectations, and they stopped, they don't have a proficiency test anymore after you start college to keep following them with the same variables.
Do we know anything about attrition
from community colleges to four-year colleges, attrition after that transfer happens between blacks and whites?
Not here. That's in there, but so it was like 8th grade, 10th grade, 12th grade, in school, big survey, and then after when they were 20, 2 years after graduation, it was by phone. And so the number of questions asked was really reduced a lot. It was just sort of, are you in school, are you working, what's your major?